Dr. Shannon Coates, you mentioned in your bio that you aren't mad about hanging out with academic voice teachers. So I just want to start by being really nosy and asking one, why is that? And two, not that I class myself as an academic voice teacher or anything like that, but what do I need to do to make sure that over the next 2 weeks I don't land myself in hot water?
That is hilarious that you're starting there. I love it. Yes, this is the part of the reason that I do what I do is that I came into academia, I did my master's and my doctorate later in my teaching career. And so I came into academia having already taught an independent voice studio and having already been in that environment, working with that type of student, which I like to call a generalist approach. So as an independent voice teacher, a typical independent voice teacher, I should say, we have this sort of generalist approach where folks are coming into the studio from all kinds of backgrounds, from in many different ways of coordinating and many different levels of coordination already achieved, tons of different goals, lots of reasons for being there. Sometimes no reason except my mom wants me to take singing lessons, like all of these various, very wide and broad kinds of singers that we're working with. And so when I did my uh, graduate work, I did my graduate work obviously in academia. And a lot of the resources and a lot of the teaching was delivered through a lens of working with singers who are at a very specific stage in their development and who are at a very specific age. So these are matured bodies that we're talking about, or matured adult instruments we're talking about for the most part. And we're talking about folks who are, in that 18 to like 25-year-old range. And we're talking about students who, for the most part, especially when I did my master's work, for the most part, we were talking about singers who wanted to sing Western classical styles. And we were talking about singers who are relatively well trained and at a specific level of coordination already because they were able to get into the program, right? So the vast majority of the training at that time and the vast majority of what was coming out of academia at that time was all through this lens of these are the students you will work with. And so much of what I actually studied in academia, I did my master's, my doctorate, much of it was not as useful for teaching independently and teaching the student population that I was working with as it could have been. And because I already had the experience working with that population, I was able to articulate that. So very robust program, wonderful teachers, and I was able to say, this is wonderful information if I was going to go and teach and work with, 18 to 24-year-olds who want to sing opera. This is wonderful and absolutely not applicable for the 6-year-olds who want to sing Adele. Like this is not useful for basically 99% of the rest of the singers I work with. Like it's just not useful information. So because it's delivered through that lens, and also because I already had that experience, right? So that is part of the reason that I started to, while I was doing my doctorate work, but also afterwards, I started to work in the way that I work and develop the resources that I have developed. There are more resources now that look through the lens of who you're actually going to be working with when you're working in an independent voice studio versus this sort of very homogenized kind of group of people that you will likely encounter in an academic setting or in a specialized voice studio. So you can be an independent voice teacher and have a specialized voice studio, right? So not being associated with academia does not mean that you are a generalist voice teacher. Still, you may still only work with, teenagers who sing music theater, and that's wonderful. And also you need pedagogy that is specific to that. That is not, and also that is not necessarily the stuff you're going to get in academia. Not necessarily. There are other programs now. There's lots of great things happening, but that's where that comes from. So it comes from the fact that I am intentionally developing resources that are specific to the needs of your sort of typical independent voice teacher, and that are around pedagogy, how we teach, not just anatomy and physiology, here's the things you need to know to diagnose, but how we teach, actual pedagogy. And I'm developing resources that are very specifically aimed at the voice teacher that I have been. I have transitioned fully into working with voice teachers now, so I no longer have an independent voice studio. However, the voice teacher that I was for a decade and a half, and what I understand the needs of independent voice teachers to be. That was a long answer to a question there. You're welcome.
Do you miss teaching singing?
Yes and no. I miss teaching one-on-one voice lessons to a certain extent. And I have so much joy in working with voice teachers, and I work with voice teachers with their students, right? So I do quite a lot of teaching vicariously, and there's a lot of joy in working with voice teachers to develop teaching skills. I mean, that's wonderful. So yeah, yes, a little bit, mostly no.
Yeah. Well, we're so glad that you're here to join us and help us voice teachers understand a little bit more on the topic of neurodiversity in the studio. And now April has sprung, and it's a time where a lot of societies and organizations relate the month to things like Autism Awareness or Autism Acceptance Month.
Mm-hmm.
And a fair chunk of your work is dedicated to using a neurodiversity affirming lens to build more inclusive spaces for singers, which is actually the title of your 2023 article published in the Journal of Singing. So congratulations for that.
Thank you. I'll just to be clear, that's a column versus an article. In journals, that's a quite a specific difference. For the rest of us, it doesn't matter so much, but just to be clear, any academics who are listening, it was a column, not an article.
That's how you know I'm not the academic voice teacher. If anyone needed it confirming.
It's absolutely fine. Yeah.
But what was the catalyst for this becoming such an important part of your work?
So my lots of close personal experience with neurodivergence and with understanding concepts around supporting neurodivergent people. In terms of my children both have several neurodivergences, and we could talk about the language there in a minute too, but several diagnoses, including autism, ADHD. There are some learning differences there, including dyslexia, some other processing differences, and they also know that I talk about them in this way, just FYI, and they are very much on board and happy for me to talk about them in this way. This is not they are very much aware. FYI.
Sign a disclaimer.
Yes, disclaimer. Yes. Well, they didn't sign a disclaimer, but we have the conversation, ongoing conversation around that. So, and so in the process of working with my own children and developing supports for them, understanding what supports in the educational system looked like, understanding what behaviors looked like for them, and being able to understand why certain kinds of behaviors, why they're responding in certain ways, et cetera. Understanding those things, going through lots of therapy with them, and finding those supports for them for the educational system. In the process of that, I also then started to see some of those similar behaviors in the studio. So as I'm working in the studio, and so I'm hearing in one ear when I'm in therapy with one of my kids, or I'm at the school with one of my kids, or I'm with the, accommodation teacher with one of my kids, or the special resources, et cetera. I'm hearing so this can be supported with XYZ, and here's what we can do for, XYZ, and here's why, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, oh, in the voice studio, so-and-so is also reacting and or behaving and or, I don't know if you could hear that, my cat is having fun in the background. And or doing something that seems very similar to what I've just had explained to me and what I just understood to be happening in one of my kids. And I can also then bring that same support and affirmation into the studio when I'm working with this singer. And so as I started to develop those, that teaching, frankly, it's teaching. But as I started to develop that, then I started to notice those behaviors quite a lot, and started to notice sort of reactions and the ways that people were interacting and engaging, and started saying, I can set up my studio in such a way that no one has to disclose to me, because the vast majority of the singers I was working with had not disclosed anything to me about the way that their neurology worked or how they learn or anything along those lines. And so I started to sort of just set things up in the studio in a way that offered folks options. And so then I started, kind of clicking through with the thought that what would be in my ideal world, what would be amazing is if my children and other children went to school and never had to ask for an accommodation, because everything was already offered. And not only was it offered, it was affirmed. These options were affirmed and normalized in the classroom. And obviously, I can't change the education system, but I have a lot of influence and can change the way we run our independent voice studios, or at least offer some of these ideas to independent voice teachers, because that is where I have some influence, right? That's who I talk to all the time. So that sort of has become the kind of driving force behind building inclusive voice studios, understanding neurodiversity affirming VoicePed, where the ultimate goal is singers come into the voice studio, and because voice teachers have done the work to understand and to offer options, singers do not have to disclose anything, and they don't necessarily have to ask for accommodations, because those things are already present in the voice studio, normalized. Anyone can have these options. That's a lofty goal. And still, I think it's achievable that we can have voice studios where these options are normalized. And so then there's an affirmation there of neurodiversity versus I feel like I have to come and ask for you to work in a specific way with me, because otherwise I'm not going to be successful.
Mm. And before we delve into what we can be setting up in our studios, can we just talk about the language for a second and
Certainly, yes.
get a handle on the things that maybe would be more beneficial for us to use? You wrote in your column about how the terms neurodiversity and neurodivergent, how they're pretty recent terms. I think only in the last 24, 26 years or so. What do they mean, and what terms are they umbrellaing, if that's a word?
I love it. If it's not a word, we're using it now. So yes, neurodiversity has come through as a large umbrella to describe the fact that there are several neurotypes. There are lots of neurotypes, lots of ways of processing, lots of ways of engaging, lots of ways of learning, ways of learning, methods of learning methodologies. That all has some baggage from educational systems. So I don't mean it in that sense. I mean it in the sense of processing. So there are lots of ways of processing, gathering information, processing that information, learning. And the neurodiversity umbrella is is considered a description for a movement that is based in recognizing and accepting that there are many ways of processing, many kinds of neurotypes in this world, in the same way that we see diversity in plants, in animals, in everything else in nature, we see diversity. And we don't call, one flower not as good a flower because it's not the same as a rose. It's just different. In that same way, there is diversity present in brains and in the way we process. And so that is neurodiversity, then, is the movement and the name for this affirmation versus, so we wouldn't use it to say I'm a neurodiverse person. It doesn't necessarily refer to me or to an individual. It refers to an entire group of people. And it encompasses neurotypical folks. So we're in a whole group of classroom. All of us are going to be, it's a neurodiverse classroom, meaning there are neurotypical and neurodivergent people in the classroom, right? It's neurodiverse. Everyone is neurodiverse. The group is neurodiverse. So then what the language that has emerged to talk about individual neurodifferences or neurotypes is neurodivergent. And so neurodivergent then encompasses anything that is any way of processing, engaging a neurotype that is different from the typical and or what society has considered the norm. So in the past, and still today in some ways, it has been pathologized. So things that are divergent from the norm or what society considers the norm has been pathologized. We've seen that with everything. In gender, we've seen that in gender. We see that. I mean, we just see it everywhere. If you are diverging from what society considers to be the norm, then that is pathologized. So things like autism, for example, has been pathologized, still is to a certain extent, but the neurodiversity movement says these are all valid ways of being in the world. And none of these should be pathologized or fixed. They do not need to be fixed. Supported, perhaps. Fixed, no. So the neurodivergence then is a large umbrella term, and anything that, again, is divergent from sort of typical is considered to be a neurodivergence. So ADHD, or autism, as we talked about, is probably one of the most well-known, or often when we say someone is neurodivergent or someone says they're neurodivergent, often that is what our brains go to first, is autism. So autism, ADHD, Tourette's, OCD, lots of those different neurotypes are considered to be a neurodivergence, or that person who is considered a neurodivergent person. We also talk about acquired neurodivergence. There are lots of folks and areas, lots of folks who talk about the fact that anxiety may actually be considered an acquired neurodivergence because it causes the brain to function in a different way. Trauma can be considered an acquired neurodivergence. There are, head injuries can be considered an acquired neurodivergence. There are lots of different things, lots of different conversations, around what that umbrella is and what is encompassed by that term. And that is a developing conversation, to be sure, what is encompassed by that term. But yes, the sort of main things that we associate with neurodivergence are ADHD and autism. They're probably the most well-known, if you will, and the ones that, like I said, we consider to be neurodivergent. So then neurotypical is the individual who does not have a neurodivergence, or perhaps, yeah, does not, which when we start to think about anxiety perhaps as being an acquired neurodivergence, we start to think, are there any actual neurotypical people in the world? Who knows? But that's a whole other conversation. But so neurotypical, and then allistic, A-L-L-I-S-T-I-C, allistic tends to be the term used for folks like myself, who are ADHD folks, but not autistic. So allistic meaning I am neurodivergent, but not autistic. So does that all
Yeah.
track? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I've been in conversations or webinars where there has been reference to things like superpowers as a way to describe these experiences and how they could be used for advantage. And I know that we before we came on, we just spoke about that a little bit, and how some people might like that and others may not. Maybe it conjures up a bit of a patronizing reference, whereas some find it quite empowering. So what's the current thought on using something like that? And is there maybe a better word that we could use in those scenarios?
Mm-hmm. So the issue with that language in general is that it sort of conjures up this, exactly as you're saying, this patronizing kind of idea that you're special, and these are the special people that, well, they're not, they can't function this way, but they have a superpower over here, and you can see how that might not feel good for folks who, and also for folks who are experiencing neurodivergence as a disability. And again, this is also around language. There are lots of folks in the neurodivergent community who do not consider neurodivergence a disability, in the sense that the disability is there because society is not set up for them to function. So that is the disability. The disability is not something inherently wrong with me. The disability is that society is set up for neurotypical people to function. And so I am being excluded in some ways. Society is much more challenging for me to participate in some ways, because of the neurotypical expectations. And so that becomes the disability or the disabling factor. Now, that is not true for lots of folks. Lots of folks in the disabled community do not think about disability in that way. So I want to just be clear that that is an ongoing conversation in lots of areas. But at the same time, we see that when we're using superpower for someone who is experiencing that same superpower, in big quotes, as not empowering at all, that feels very patronizing and gaslighting, right? It feels very gaslighty. It does not feel like you have seen me as a person. I understand the impetus. I understand the intention behind framing things in that way. And also, it's also a little bit, saviorism. It's a little bit ableist. I mean, it can be just really perceived and taken in a not useful way. So that also then comes back to some of the language we use, especially around autism, where we talk about high functioning or low functioning autistic people, and that many people in the autistic community are very much against those kinds of labels, those functioning labels, because it doesn't, first of all, it divides autistic people into sort of good autistic people and bad autistic people, big quotes there, and to people who can function and people who cannot. And again, this isn't necessarily around whether I intrinsically can function. It is around what society is set up for me to be able to function in, and our voice studios. And so the function language becomes this, again, it can become really patronizing. And it can also be a way, often, well-meaning doctors, physicians, well-meaning voice teachers will say, oh, but he's really high functioning, so it's okay. It can be a way to sort of placate for, like, oh, I'm sorry he is autistic, or I'm sorry they're autistic, you know? So it can be a way to sort of placate or soften the blow. But that then reveals that we think that autism is a pathology, right? That then reveals that how we actually think about autism or ADHD or any of these other neurodivergences. And shows still that we are pathologizing. And so then we feel like this is something that we really have to soften the blow for the poor parent or whatever. And so the language that is more useful, and that the vast majority, I shouldn't say vast majority, the autistic community is not a monolith, of course, but the autistic folks who I follow on social media, who I learn from, talk about using language such as support needs language. So we talk about high supports needs or low supports needs. And then we talk about using the actual words of what their supports needs are. So you are a high supports needs person. In other words, you may need support in daily living activities. So you may need support in cooking meals. You may need support in those kinds of ways. You are a low supports needs person. So you may need supports in culture establishing culture and articulating culture. So I do not need you to look at me directly in my eyes the whole time we're talking, because I understand that part of what you need in order to be able to focus is to not look directly in my eyes as we're having a conversation. So that might be considered a lower support need person, but there's still some needs there. It's just a different kind of support need, if you will. Again, the language is evolving, and the language is, there are lots of autistic folks out there who are no longer using the language of neurodivergence and neurotypical as well. So there's some evolving language in that sense as well. So the language is evolving. And I think, to your point about you've been in educational seminars where you've heard this kind of language, yeah, one of the main challenges that you will hear autistic people in particular talking about is that, and this comes back to teaching so beautifully as well, and pedagogy so beautifully, is that decisions are being made for them without them being in the room. And so the saying is, nothing about us without us. And that then becomes, I am going to use the language that you, as an autistic person, as a neurodivergent person, prefer. So whatever you're preferring. And so if I, as an ADHD person, say, I have this superpower of hyperfocus. When I can tap into my hyperfocus, it's a superpower. If I am using it in that way, great. Then we're using that together. When someone is imposing the language on me, and especially someone who is not experiencing ADHD, who is not autistic, who is not dyslexic, etc. Like when someone is imposing that language, that is a whole other kettle of fish.
Mm. It's almost like we talk about in terms of terminology in other areas as well, not to diminish this being focused on people, but recently spoke with Lynn Hilton about terminology and how many names there are for registers and anatomical terminology, and that really we just want to reflect and mirror the terminology that the person in the room is using. So if they're using M1, we'll use M1. If they prefer chest voice, that's fine, we can use that as well. So it's using the language that they provide, and that can be our guide.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, and that is part of it too. Again, coming back to pedagogy, as you're talking about, the more I work with voice teachers around inclusivity from a neurodiversity affirming lens, the more our pedagogy changes, where we start to see, oh, what does the student want? What does that singer want? What is their experience, right? We begin to, rather than impose our experience and or our functional knowledge on them and say, well, you should be using M1, you should be using a TA dominant sound. And also it's going to feel like you have extra pressurization, blah, blah. Like this is what it's going to feel like, instead of imposing our experience and or functional knowledge on the singer we are working with. We examine what their experience is, and we use the words that they want to use 100%.
Just pressing the pause button on the podcast for a very brief moment to invite you to book your free BAST call. If you've been thinking about joining the BAST community through one of our courses, but you just don't know which option is the best for you, then why not book your free Zoom chat with our very own Kimberly George, who has all the answers. Head over to basttraining.com/book-a-call/ and click that big blue button. That's basttraining.com/book-a-call/. Now, where were we?
Let's explore some of the neurodiversities that come under that umbrella. And just to say, this isn't because these are the most important ones and we pick them in order of priority. It's nothing like that. It's just ones that perhaps we might see in the studio and want to learn more of. But there will be opportunities for people to then go and explore other ones as well. They're all equally as important. So just starting with dyslexia, can you help us understand what dyslexia is and how it might typically present in a singer?
Yep, absolutely. Dyslexia is a processing difference. There are actually a couple of different kinds or ways that dyslexia can show up, and a bunch of different ways that it can affect what is happening. The most typical form is challenges processing and recognizing symbols, which letters are symbols. And so a great example of the symbols, processing symbols, is, for example, the letter G, the letter B, the letter D, and the letter P. Those are all a stick and a ball, right? Lowercase. They're all just a stick and a ball. So if you are a dyslexic person, they look the same to you. They are literally all the same thing. I don't understand, because all I see is the stick and the ball. I don't understand that for a P, the stick is on this side, and for a G, the stick is on that side, and that's what differentiates them. So the challenge then can also be in associating actual phonemes or sounds to those syllables at the same time, and also then trying to put all of those, those symbols, and then also trying to put all of those symbols together with their phonemes and in the order that they need to be in, right? So there's all of these challenges in terms of dyslexia. So when you think about that in terms of perhaps learning music or learning to read music, learning to read music is a whole other language with a whole bunch of sticks and balls, like tons. They just look like, that's all they look like. Everything, quarter notes or semi-demi quavers or whatever you guys call them over there. They all just look like they're all basically just the same symbol. And not only that, we put them on a music staff where they're like is that the second line, the third line? I can't figure out where that actually is. And also, I have to make sure that I'm looking at the treble clef versus the bass clef. Like what? And then I also have to figure out, all of these hashtags and little tiny bees. What are those? They're sharps and flats? I'm sorry, what now? So there is a ton of symbol processing that goes on when we're trying to learn how to read music, as well as the association, not just of the symbol and figuring out what the actual symbol is, but the association of the symbol to a pitch, to a meaningful pitch, and then the relationship between those pitches. So not only are we also figuring out pitch, but we're figuring out rhythm, note duration from those symbols, right? So not only does that symbol represent a pitch, it represents a duration. And when we ask folks, not only that, when singing, we ask folks to also read at the same time, read actual words at the same time. So the amount of processing of symbols that is going on and making those symbols meaningful and trying to find meaning in those symbols that is going on, for a dyslexic person, that can be incredibly frustrating and unbelievably challenging. And so one of the things that, as as I talk about quite a lot when we're talking about student-led learning, one of the things, or inclusive voice studios, one of the things that we as voice teachers often have in our head is that it is our responsibility to teach singers how to read music. That is something that is very important. That's part of our responsibility. That's what we're getting paid for. In many cases, it feels like what we're getting paid for. And that is part of a, quote, good education, right? Musical education is that they should be able to read music. And while that isn't necessarily wrong, let me put that forward, that is certainly not wrong. It is also not useful for lots of singers. So lots of singers do not need to learn to read music in order to accomplish their goals. So, and lots of singers perhaps want to learn to read chords, or want to simply be able to follow a melody line, or want to be able to listen to the melody and put their own melody line over top of lyrics. Or, I mean, there are so many other ways that we can teach musicality and that we can encourage musicality and music literacy without teaching full on stabs and here's what you have to know, right? So many of the expectations that we tend to have, especially as independent voice teachers, where we're working with young singers often, where we feel like that is part of our responsibility is to make sure that this young singer is trained well. We need to do some examining of what success looks like and what the goal of the student is. What is the actual goal of the student? Yeah, there's lots to unpack there in terms of what we believe our job is in the voice studio and how that impacts what we think success looks like, and how that impacts what we think is important as part of musical training. And dyslexia is a great example of how trying to teach someone who is dyslexic to read music is going to may put singers off for life. They may never want to take singing lessons again or do music again because that is an integral part. They believe that that's an integral part of what they're supposed to do, whether they understand that they are dyslexic or not. That frustration is going to be deep. The other thing that I'll say is that one of the things that we can do in voice studios so that we do not have to, so that we can support dyslexic singers and lots of other folks who are learning to read. Like if you're working with children, folks who are learning to read, they're learning to read. And now we're also asking them to learn another language essentially at the same time, right? So there are lots of things we can do. There are fonts that are dyslexic friendly. Just Google it. There are dyslexic friendly fonts that you can use. There are colors that you can, that are a higher contrast and font sizes that are more useful. And you can just offer that in the voice studio. You don't have to be like, oh, you're dyslexic, let me get out the special paper and font for you. You can just use a dyslexic friendly font to print out music. I mean, you're the voice teacher, are you not? You can just do that. You can also just print the music out if you want to, or have it on an iPad so that you can have it large so they can look at it in, big. Or you can, there are so many options where you can just have that already in the voice studio, and then no one has to say, I'm dyslexic, would you please make this work better for me?
Yeah.
You can just have it already there.
Yeah. And who doesn't want their lyrics on colored paper? Come on.
I know. Why not?
Yeah. Why is it always this white stuff?
Yeah. I know. Oh, yeah. Lots of options for sure. There is also a symbol-based music reading system, and I cannot recall the name of it now. It is Googleable as well, but there is a symbol-based music reading system that is less challenging than the one that we typically use. So there is that as well out there, which is a possibility, especially if you're working with children in the voice studio. Yeah.
let's talk about ADHD. What
Mhm.
does the acronym stand for? And I
Mhm.
know that just coming across the acronym as well, some people don't quite like how
Yeah,
it's also been described. So,
yeah,
yeah, can you help us understand that a little bit
absolutely.
more?
Yep. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You're welcome. And that is the actual acronym and name in the DSM. Possibly also in Europe, you have I cannot remember the name of it now, but it's a similar manual for diagnosing, and it's sort of like the Bible, if you will, of pathology and diagnosis. The issue with the name, attention deficit, that's the first issue with the name. And then hyperactivity disorder. So the second issue, and also disorder, we know now that there are several different ways that ADHD manifests. And we talk about ADHD actually being three sort of types of ADHD, and one of them is hyperactivity. However, hyperactivity is associated with young boys and young white upper class boys, middle upper class boys. I don't mean that in the British sense. I mean that in the financial sense, in the financial stability sense, right? So folks who have which may be also the British sense. I don't know. I feel like the British sense, there's a very specific upper class kind of thing. I don't know. I could be wrong there. However, I mean it in the sort of like financially, when you walk into the doctor's office, your financial status does not contribute to the judgment, right? You have privilege because of your financial status, if you will. So hyperactivity is a typical behavior that we see in boys, in kids who we perceive to be male and who are white and who are overwhelmingly white and who are of a certain financial status. And so that is a very restricted, a very small segment of the population of folks who have and who are ADHD. And obviously, there's a lot of stuff in there. So, as we talk about well, my son um, is not hyperactive. In fact, is incredibly well behaved. Well behaved. I'm going to put that in big quotes because there's a lot of stuff going on with him being, quote, well behaved. He is well behaved because of fear and anxiety for breaking the rules. And so he lives in a whole world of total fear and anxiety. And as a child, lived in a whole world of fear and anxiety for breaking the rules or getting in trouble. And so that is why he is, quote, well behaved. So that is a whole other thing that is, yay, well behaved. No, not yay. But hyperactivity, he may never have been diagnosed for ADHD if we had not taken him because of some of his issues with reading. So he's severely dyslexic. So some of his issues with reading meant that we took him in to have what's called in Canada a psychoeducational assessment. And through that assessment, that's when they diagnosed him with ADHD. And we were like, what? No one would think that he is ADHD because at the time, the only thing that we thought of was hyperactivity. And so if you have an ADHD kid who is Black, for example, in Canada, who is Native, for example, and they are displaying hyperactivity, the chances of them being diagnosed with ADHD is very low compared to my son being diagnosed with ADHD, who may exhibit exactly the same behaviors, because we will say that kid is just bad parenting, etc. Right? So we attribute, again, that name very much describes ADHD, very much describes a very typical, what we used to think of as a typical presentation of ADHD. There are lots of presentations of ADHD now. And so we understand there to be lots of different ways of presenting as ADHD. The highest diagnosed type of ADHD is inattentive. So ADHD/inattentive. And that would be what what I would have, and both of my children as well, where it is externally, I am there. I am paying attention. I am 100% on. And externally, I look like I am in control. I'm on it. And internally, all of that hyperactivity that we might associate with a 10-year-old boy with ADHD, that's all happening in my brain. Look at this, all just happening in my brain internally. So there's a lot of, we talked about this before we came on as well, there's a lot of misdiagnosis around ADHD because of what we have thought ADHD to be for so long, especially with folks we perceive to be female, especially with folks who are socialized female. So we're socialized female, we socialize folks we perceive to be female as sit down, be quiet, you must, follow these rules, etc. And we socialize folks we perceive to be male as, well, go have an adventure. That's boys will be boys. That's fine. I know he's just jumping off the walls. Boy mom. I really want to hurt people when I hear boy mom. I just have to say, and maybe not hurt people, maybe not that far, but that saying really gets on my nerves because we socialize boys in a very specific way, and that shows up in the actual way that and girls, we socialize them in specific ways, and that shows up in the ways that ADHD manifests and autism as well. And it means that we have a much lower diagnosis of both autism and ADHD in folks we perceive to be female than in folks and who are socialized female than in folks we perceive to be male and who are socialized male. So that is a statistic that is changing. It certainly is changing. The more we know, we understand more. We also have adults. I mean, this is one of the wonderful things about social media and about the rise of social media, is that we have so many autistic adults in particular, ADHD adults in particular, adults who are on the socials with platforms who are doing educational work around what it feels like, what their experiences are, what I prefer in terms of what I would like you to call me and how I would like you to refer to my experience. So that is one of the wonderful things about social media. The amount of people I know who have diagnosed themselves from TikTok is it's fascinating. And I know there's some grumbling around that from some folks, but also I would say that, there's nothing wrong with getting a little education that helps you to understand the way that you work in the world. Is wonderful, very validating, very validating. Okay, we got off topic. Hi, ADHD brain. we went into another thing. So I will say too, that the way that ADHD can show up in the voice studio, ADHD is the vast majority of folks who are ADHD, especially children and adolescents, also have an executive function challenge or underdeveloped executive function. Now, executive function does not develop until we are in our 20s anyway. Executive function is a skill that we are developing all the way through our lives, for the most part, and certainly through our childhood and adolescence. So that is a developing skill, executive function. All of the skills that allow us to sort of program and do the things we want to do, be organized, all of those things. And while there is while that executive function, underdeveloped executive function skills are present in the general population, certainly, it is very high in ADHD folks. So that underdeveloped executive function, very high compared to the sort of neurotypical population. And so there's a combination there of both ADHD and executive function skills that can be really challenging, especially if we're working with young singers, adolescent singers, can be very challenging. So the executive function, I'll leave that sort of off the table, but I just wanted to make sure that we're understanding that that is a big part of ADHD as well. is just developing executive function skills. How do we support folks to develop executive function skills? There's that. Tara Semter, by the way, is a wonderful ADHD executive function coach and educator, someone to look up, and perhaps we'll get her on the in links. So ADHD, one of my favorite ways to describe ADHD, the reason for some ADHD behavior is this. ADHD is an interest-based nervous system, which means that we are motivated by sort of one of three things. We're motivated by interest/novelty. Something is interesting or new. And we're motivated by competition, which sounds negative, but is actually positive. I'll come to it in a minute. And we are motivated by urgency, so deadlines, but urgency that matters. So the deadline has to matter. There has to be something pretty big in order to meet that deadline. So for myself, for example, even when I think something is important and I know that I should prioritize the thing, even when I want to do the thing, I still have to set up either novelty, interest, urgency, or competition in order to do it. What that means in our studios is in terms of practicing, for example. Practicing is terrible for ADHD folks. There's a lot of challenge there. There's also executive function stuff that goes into that, building up practice, for example. It's very tricky to practice. I have 3 performance-based degrees. I have done a lot of practicing and a lot of performing in academia and with that kind of pressure. And the things that I set up for myself, I did not realize until 4 or 5 years ago that I had done that for myself. And some of the supports that I had put in place for myself, I now externalize and do and put in place. But those were the things that I developed for myself in order to be able to do the things I wanted to do. And I felt badly about them at the time. I felt like I was lazy and I was a procrastinator and I had no discipline, very undisciplined person, et cetera, et cetera. I have a doctorate. Clearly, I can get things done. However, my internal dialogue has been and continues to a certain extent to this day to be that I'm a lazy, unorganized, procrastinating, undisciplined person. And so some of the things that I put into place for myself, I put into place interest and novelty when I was practicing. So I will always practice the new piece or sing the new thing before I'll sing anything that I'm working on. Always. That's always in my brain. I want to practice the new thing. I want to get into the new thing. The novelty of it is the thing that gets me doing it. So that is something to consider if you are practicing. Have something new that you are always just kind of working on, because that will get you started into practicing. It will actually get you doing the thing you want to do. And when you're working with singers who you suspect may be ADHD, that may also be something to consider. Not necessarily offering something that they have to learn but offering, hey, what's something you discovered this week? I would love for you to, discover a little bit more. That will get you to the table, right? It'll get you to the piano, if you will. The second thing is competition. Competition in ADHD circles, we talk about mirroring. And working in working together. So I would do practice sessions where, and this is in university, I would do practice sessions where I would have a pianist come in, my piano friend, and we would practice together, because they would practice, a piece, and then I'd be singing and I'd sit in the corner and practice. Just having someone there means that I'm going to do the thing. ADHD folks talk about cleaning my house. All I need is for you to come, let's say you're going to come over to my house and I will clean my house. I will not do it otherwise. Or come over and sit in the room with me while I clean my house, because that is a thing that is going to help me to actually just do the thing. With Zoom and with the pandemic, we have normalized the idea of being on Zoom together to create music. And so you can set up in your studio, group practice sessions where singers What do? We meet every other day at 4 o'clock, whatever it is, and we meet for half an hour. Everybody tells everybody else. We meet on Zoom. Everybody tells everybody else what I'm working on and what I'm hoping to get done. Then we set a timer for half an hour, and we leave our cameras on. Very important. We leave our cameras on, so we all are like, but we mute our mics, and then we come back at the end of the half an hour and we just tell each other what we did. That is competition/mirroring in action that will help you to do some practicing if that is something that you suspect in your brain. Urgency is, I set up a bunch of, I learned in my master's, I learned to set up a dress rehearsal that I called myself a dress rehearsal a month to 6 weeks before the actual performance. Because if I have a dress rehearsal that is the day before, that is not urgent enough. So 6 weeks before, and sorry, the dress rehearsal the day before means that I'm just practicing like the day before the dress rehearsal, right? Maybe a little bit sooner than that, but not much sooner than that. And so the dress rehearsal needs to come at the point where I need my butt to get kicked, and I need to start to get scared about the fact that I don't know this music well enough yet. So that dress rehearsal at 6 weeks before is embarrassing. It is embarrassing, and I know it's going to be embarrassing, and I'm in there and I'm like, okay, that hurt a lot. Can we have another dress rehearsal in 2 weeks? And then I am moving toward that dress rehearsal, and then I'm prepared for the performance. So we can do that in our voice studios as well. We can set up performance classes, if you will, where we've got, other singers in, just to see where we are in the learning process. It isn't about like you have to be perfected. This is where you are in the learning process. Or you can invite the singer who has their lesson before you to stay for an extra 15 minutes, or the singer who has their lesson after you to come in 15 minutes early. You can develop that kind of studio culture where we get to be in, and that can depending on the singer, but that can help to increase some urgency, and allow for that motivating factor that allows you to do the thing you actually want to do. It supports you. That's a support system to allow you to do the thing you want to do. As a neurodivergent teacher, so as an ADHD teacher, I also have similar things set up as a business owner. I have similar things set up where I co-work, over Zoom with friends, and we literally talk to each other. Hey, what are you doing today? Great. Let's check in half an hour. Let's get the thing done. So lots of those things, recognizing that is the way that my brain works, first of all, has been so validating and so releasing, if you will, and also has helped me to then be really intentional about setting up the things that will help me to get the things done that I want to do,
Can I ask a question about the novelty? So if we're working with somebody who has disclosed or even hasn't disclosed having ADHD or being ADHD, is it enough to do something like, hey, we're going to start with a new tongue twister, or we're going to start by exploring splat breaths or whatever it might be, even if they don't necessarily need it in their technical, bits.
Yeah.
Is that still enough?
Absolutely. And I would take it even a step further. What would you like to start with? Would you like to start with splat breath? Would you like to start with a tongue twister? Would you like to start with jumping jacks? Would you like to start with your song?
Yeah.
Do singers really need to, this is a whole other topic. Do singers really need to actually warm up at the beginning of every single lesson, especially if you're working with a 12-year-old who's been talking the whole day? No, unlikely. They actually need to warm up. So you can put all of the aspects of the lesson on a whiteboard and let them choose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
I was working with children in the voice studio. I had all of the aspects of the lesson. Sometimes I put them into a thing they could pick out, or on a picker wheel. And one of the things that I always had in the lesson was we get a break to pet the cat, and we also have a piano show off break. So you get to come over to the piano and you show me anything that you figured out how to play this week in the piano. This is singing lessons. Show me anything. And also a break to sing for me something that, or some, not a break, but a spot to sing something that you are listening to right now that you love. Warm-up exercise, a breathing exercise, a stretching exercise, a whatever. All of those things can go in the whole list, and they get to choose which one do they want to do. They can choose whatever they want in whatever order they want, right? And then they feel like they have some agency in the lesson. It's interesting for them because they are like, ooh, I get to choose? Okay. Got some agency in the lesson. They also get to decide. They also start to understand how they might want to order their practicing too.
Yeah. What about the term focus in on when you're
Right.
working with somebody with or experiencing ADHD? Is that just a bit of a bad thing to say?
Oh gosh, it's such a good question. Not necessarily. So when we are directing folks on what to focus in on and or what they should be paying attention to, it isn't as effective for any brain or any learner as drawing their attention to what they want to focus in on and or what they want to do and or what they want to pay attention to in the lesson. So no matter who we're working with, the more effective reframe is, what did you notice? What would you like to do next? Where would you like to apply this? So we discover something in an exercise, for example. We discover a new coordination in an exercise that we're doing, our technical exercise. We discover that. Amazing. Where would you like to sing this in your song? Out of all of the songs we're doing right now, what would you like to apply this to right now? So maybe we discovered in an exercise we were just doing, maybe we discovered like a high belt mix. Amazing. You love that sound. We figured that out. Where would you like to sing this? That means rather than me saying, okay, let's apply this right away to XYZ, or I want you to go home and sing this on blah, blah, blah. Do you see how I just directed them? And I took away some of their agency in a way. And I also taught them that I know what they need to do next, rather than modeling that they can choose. And that when they go home to practice, they can choose. They can notice, I discovered this thing. Am I practicing? Ooh, where do I want to sing that? Ooh, and I have never, in working in this way with singers, they have never been wrong. They've never been wrong about where they want to apply it. Sometimes they've applied things in ways that I had not thought of or would never have thought of. And sometimes they've applied things where I was like, oh, there's probably a better way to do that, but they've never been wrong in terms of where that application works for them. And so then I don't necessarily have to be the one who is telling them what to focus on or where to focus, if that makes sense. The more I can offer the option, the more their buy-in will be, the higher the buy-in is, as you know. So it isn't necessarily wrong or problematic to say focus in on. I just think there's a better way to do it, a more effective way to engage and get that buy-in and get the motivation.
Coming up in part 2, we continue to explore building inclusive voice studios through a neurodiversity lens by looking at autism and Tourette syndrome. We'll meet you there.